And we better get started as soon as Julie says okay, because I know this is going to be a lot of good information. All
Yeah.
right, I'm like the co-silent moderator that's talking up right now.
Yeah. So it's me, Julie Jolin, and Zarina Merman. We are the co-moderators for Gaza in Context by Jeff Klein, a four-part series. And just a bit about Jeff Klein. He's a retired machinist and local trade union president, active with the anti-war group Dorchester for Peace and several solidarity organizations. He is a member of MAPA and leader of its Palestine-Israel Working Group. Since 2004, Jeff has traveled to Palestine almost every year, last in 2022, and also elsewhere in the Middle East, and developed an incredible understanding of the events currently, as well as all his reading and speaking with people to understand the history of what he's seeing. Jeff has spoken many times about the Israeli-Palestine issue in schools, churches, community and peace organizations, mosques, and he has appeared on local and international TV and radio. So we're very lucky to have this four-part series, and we will, with no further ado, start that. Thank you, Jeff.
Thank you, Julie, and welcome everybody. This is a series, a four-part series that is a shorter version of a course I taught for 10 years at the Lifelong Learning Institute connected to UMass Boston. It was one of the most popular courses they offered and got almost unanimous, very high rating from the students, but it was canceled this fall because some pro-Israel people got wind of it and decided that it didn't sufficiently support the Israeli or pro-Israeli narrative. And they reached out to the board of directors of the program and put pressure on them, which they caved to. And the course got canceled after 10 years. So this is the alternative. And I'm happy that I'm reaching more people this way than I did at the course that got canceled. I also, by the way, just indicative of how much people are being trolled on this issue. I also spoke in the fall of 2023. I gave two talks. I was invited to give two talks in Winchester at their senior center, and it was so well received that they asked me to do two more until someone intervened with the board of directors and got that canceled as well. So it's no hardship for me to be canceled. I'm retired. I don't make a living talking about or teaching about the Middle East, but it's just a slight indication of what we face on the issue of free speech on our issue and how much repression there is for people who are really vulnerable, people whose jobs or student statuses are at stake. We live in a very difficult time. We have to fight back to organize for freedom of speech on this issue. So I'm going to hopefully share my screen, and I will be doing that as we go along with slides. And
Jeff, as you're doing that, can I just say something? We are not taking questions until after Jeff's done with his presentation, and then we'll be taking them from the chat. So,
thanks for letting me know. And Jeff, I already heard about what you told.
Okay, so I think whoever that was, I think we're going to mute people during the presentation. So I hope you can see me on the side and a slide covering most of the screen. Is that working?
Yeah, looks good.
Okay, good. So the name of this series is Gaza in Context. And the context, of course, is the history that led up to the current situation in Gaza and the wider region that Gaza is situated in. And I don't need to convince most of you, I think, that understanding the history is important as a tool to enrich our activism on this issue. History doesn't start today, yesterday, but has a long trail, especially in the Middle East. And knowing the history helps us to understand the present and the future. So I'm not going to go into a huge amount of detail about what's happening in Gaza today. We may go back to it in future sessions, but I'm assuming that most of you, if you're here, are following the current events pretty detailed. So I'll just summarize very briefly. This is Gaza today, and a satellite view showing almost all of it has been destroyed by Israeli bombing and shelling. Here's just one snapshot of a neighborhood in Gaza. Nobody knows for sure how many people have been killed by Israel in Gaza today. The official count, which is only verified, identified dead, is approaching 50,000. And the real count may be much, much larger now, and certainly will increase in the future, because not only are people being killed under Israeli bombs, but there's an acute danger of starvation, disease, and cold that has already claimed a number of child lives in Gaza, because it does get down to the 40s, even the high 30s in Gaza in the wintertime. It's rainy, and people are living with very minimal shelter, if any, in tents and so on. So the situation in Gaza is very, very dire. And to my mind, it calls to me to recollect the Warsaw Ghetto, the Nazi liquidation of the Warsaw Ghetto in 1943 and 44, when people are basically trapped in a limited area and being bombarded and killed in their thousands. Of course, making that comparison under the definition of anti-Semitism that's being pushed by Israel and its supporters in the United States makes me an anti-Semite. We'll get back to that, I think, in future discussions. So, obviously, you're aware that Israel has been charged under the Genocide Convention with the crime of genocide. The Genocide Convention was adopted after the end of the Second World War and in response to the obvious mass killings perpetrated by the Nazis against Jews and others during the Second World War. And it has been ratified and adopted by nearly every country in the world, including Israel and the United States. And the definition involves killing members of a group, causing serious bodily or mental harm, deliberately inflicting on the group conditions of life calculated to bring about its physical destruction in whole or in part, and so on. I mean, it's so evident that this is what's happening in Gaza fits this definition. And it's not only my opinion, but many human rights organizations, Amnesty International, Human Rights Watch, Doctors Without Borders, the Israeli organization B'Tselem, who can't name it genocide, but basically defines it as that because they'd be liable under Israeli law if they did, and numerous experts on the genocide and Holocaust history, most of them Jewish and some of them Israeli, have all agreed that a genocide is taking place. South Africa brought a case under the Genocide Convention to the International Court of Justice, which has since been joined by more than 30 other countries. And it will take a long time for a final judgment, but the court has accepted that case. And the evidence that's presented so far is pretty overwhelming, not only in terms of what's happening, which has intensified since South Africa filed that charge, but, the piling up of the statements by Israelis, not just ordinary Israelis, but government officials, generals in the army and other officers of intent basically to commit genocide is overwhelming. And South Africa is right, and certainly many countries, including in Europe, Spain and Ireland, have joined, and in the Americas, Mexico, Brazil, Bolivia, Colombia, Chile have all joined the case for charging Israel with genocide. It takes a special kind of sociopathology to deny this. We can understand it from the point of view of Israel and its government, but people, supposedly well-educated people like Anthony Blinken and others in our government, are delusionally in denial of this, contrary to all rationality. And of course, they are complicit in this genocide, because complicity in genocide is also a crime under the Genocide Convention. And of course, the United States as a whole is complicit in that it is the main weapons supplier for Israel. As the bombs and shells fall on Gaza, we need to remember that every attack aircraft, every helicopter, almost all the bombs and the artillery shells that Israel is raining down on Gaza are made in the USA and supplied to Israel basically free of charge by our government. Now, we all know that the current, genocide began after the breakout from Gaza on October 7th of 2023. And there's a lot that we don't know about this, partly because of censorship and the one-sided journalism that supports Israel. But it's certainly clear that if Israel is correct in saying 1,100 people of their citizens were killed, at least a third of them and more were either active military soldiers serving or reservists who are like the people who are serving in Gaza today. And moreover, we know from Israeli press reports in particular that some number, maybe a large number of the Israelis that were killed on October 7th were victims of their own armed forces firing indiscriminately at both Palestinians and Israelis during the aftermath of the breakout from Gaza. The most lurid claims that of atrocities that were charged at the Palestinians, mass rapes, beheading of babies, and so on, have mostly been debunked now, primarily and initially by the Israeli press itself. We don't know what is true and what's not, although there certainly is no evidence that the atrocities committed, and there certainly were some atrocities that were committed on October 7th, were organized policy by Hamas. Besides the Hamas fighters, many others broke out from Gaza. And as happens in war, inevitably, atrocities are committed by soldiers on all sides, good or bad. But what's unique is that the initial propaganda blitz about the savagery and the massacres of committed by Hamas were aimed at painting the Palestinians as savage others, which often happens in colonial wars of liberation, anti-colonial wars of liberation. There's no evidence for that. And in fact, as we know from history, and I'll talk about that later, even the good side, or the quote unquote good side in war, commits atrocities. And our own country is no different from that. So, and also, if we want to understand the rage that led some individuals among the Palestinians from Gaza to commit murder or atrocity of innocent civilians, we need to remember their situation. Penned up and under siege for decades by Israel, crowded, impoverished, jobless, almost all of them either refugees or the descendants of refugees who were ethnically cleansed from the area controlled by Israel outside of Gaza today, where Israelis live in relative plenty, with good housing, jobs, swimming pools, and so on, while Gazans are crowded into refugee camps. Looking out at that, when they have a chance to break out, it's no surprise that some of them will act on that rage that has been pent up over decades. We don't excuse that, but we should understand it. And as far as the hostages goes, yes, capturing civilians is technically a war crime, but Israel has kidnapped and captured many more civilians than Hamas or the Gazans have done. And of course, many of the so-called hostages are in fact active duty military that were captured, and those are prisoners of war, not hostages. So we need to be careful about the language that we use. Now, if we look at Gaza today, if you look here as an aerial view of Gaza, it's a small sandy strip, 20-something miles long and a couple of miles wide, up to 5 miles, 5 or 6 miles. Even before October 7th, it was one of the most crowded places on earth because 2 million people lived in Gaza. And if you want to get a sense of it, imagine the outer Cape from Orleans to Provincetown. It's about that size, but with 2.3 million people in it. It's pretty incredible. And if we want to go back again, just to orient ourselves, here's the Gaza Strip along the coast bordering Israel, 1948 Israel and Egypt. And the history, it's a question when to start the history. Obviously, the Gaza Strip was part of Palestine, then the British-controlled Palestine Mandate. It was after the founding of Israel, it was occupied and not conquered because Egyptian troops had occupied it. Israel raided it successive times in the 1950s and committed massacres in 1953, 1956, when they invaded Egypt in collaboration with Britain and France. It was finally captured permanently by Israel in 1967, along with the West Bank and the Golan Heights and the Egyptian Sinai in the peace treaty that was ultimately signed between Egypt and Israel. Israel was able to retain the Gaza Strip and has retained it ever since then. It initially tried to put Israeli settlements within Gaza, but they were withdrawn eventually because it was untenable to maintain Israeli settlements and costly to maintain Israeli settlements in the midst of 2 million Gazans in a very small place. So again, in 1948, Palestinians from the rest of Israel, especially the southern part of Israel, were driven into Gaza. And by the way, it was not only 1948, this continued after the armistice of 1949, when more Palestinian towns and villages were ethnically cleansed, forced into Gaza. And again, as I said, 2/3 to 3/4 of the people who live in Gaza today, the survivors, are refugees and their descendants. Now, we're going to go back into history, but I want to point out even the recent history is kind of erased in the current coverage of Gaza, which in our press and the Israeli press began in October 7th, 2023. In fact, the first large-scale Israeli bombardment of Gaza took place at the end of 2008 and 2009, and I visited Gaza then in the summer of 2009, and this was the destruction that was evident even then. And it turns out that was the first of many, many large-scale Israeli attacks on Gaza. And this graphic shows a person who was born in 2007, lived through successive Israeli assaults on Gaza for their whole life. And that's been the history of Gaza before October 7th, 2023. And the Israelis, in a chilling way, termed these successive attacks on Gaza as mowing the lawn. That is, killing a certain number of people to keep the resistance down and knowing they were going to repeat it again and again as they have. A difference in the current attack on Gaza is that they talk now of pulling up the roots. That is committing genocide, in effect, rather than just mowing the lawn. Obviously, if things didn't start in October 7th of 2023, when did it start and why? And I'm going to talk a lot about colonialism as we go forward, because that is the necessary background for what is taking place in Gaza and the Middle East today. As you all know from history, most of the world, especially Africa, Asia, and Latin America, were colonized primarily by European empires in the late 1800s, early 1900s. And, it's the sort of outcome of that is still very much with us. And I'll get to that again. And we also, some of you have heard maybe for the first time this idea of settler colonialism. That is that Israel is a settler colonial state. And that's something that you can judge from the history that I'm going to present. But for the time being, I would like to note that in the early days of the Zionist movement, the Zionists were not hesitant at all about naming their enterprise as a colonial one. The predecessor of what's now called the Jewish National Fund was the Palestine Jewish Colonization Association. And colonialism was just part of the language of the Zionist movement until, in the Second World War and after colonialism got to have a bad name, so to speak. So colonialism, which, has its roots centuries ago, we tend to think it's something that happened only a long time ago and far away. But in fact, the world we live in today has been profoundly shaped by colonialism, the process of colonialism. And I would, just point out, for example, that I'm speaking to you from a region of the United States called New England, from the Dorchester neighborhood of Boston, both of which were named after towns in England. And I'm speaking English to you, the language that was the native language of an island across the Atlantic Ocean. And further, even today, especially in Africa, the borders of every African country were shaped by the colonial powers, and a lot of Asia too. And, effectively the United States and some of its allies like Australia and New Zealand are successful settler colonial states. That is, people who came from someplace else and displaced the indigenous inhabitants. And no area of the earth is more influenced and affected by colonialism than what we call the Middle East. This is a map which I suppose now is somewhat familiar to people, and maybe 10 or 20 years ago, much less so. But because of the U.S. wars and Israel, we have a sense of the geography of the Middle East. As one once said, war is God's way of teaching geography to Americans. So why do we call it the Middle East? If you think about it for a minute, it's one of those sort of unconscious elements of colonialism that we, are not even aware of. So here's the Middle East. As I suppose all of you know, the Earth is essentially spherical. There is, because it rotates on an axis, there's a place called the North Pole, and the South Pole. But because the Earth is round, there's no place on Earth that's either the East or the West. Every place on Earth is east or west of every other place on Earth. So the reason we call this region the Middle East is because from the point of view of the European traders and colonists, it was midway between Europe and what they call the Far East, right? And sometimes they call it the Near East, of course. Near to what? Near to Europe. So that's the origin of the phrase that is so embedded in our language that we never think about it. The Middle East, the name of the Middle East is an artifact of colonialism, but it had become so embedded in our discourse that even the people who live in the Middle East mostly call it the Middle East. Now, people who want to be really accurate correctly call it Western Asia, because Asia is a place and it has an eastern part and a western part. But the Middle East is so embedded in our language that I'll continue to use it. Just be aware where that term comes from. Now, it's a little bit arbitrary when to start looking at history. But for our purposes in the Middle East, the First World War is the key event whose leading up to it and its aftermath that affected the Middle East today and still is affecting the Middle East today. Now, we sometimes toss around the idea that there are good wars and bad wars. In my view, all wars are bad, but it is true that in some wars, one side is more vicious and heinous than another. One side may be an aggressor and the other side defending. And so, there are good sides and bad sides and maybe good, aims and bad aims in some wars. But the First World War was none of those things. It was a bad war from top to bottom. What's shown here on this map in sort of pink is the Central Powers, the enemy, so to speak. And what's shown in green is the Allies, our side, so to speak. Now, none of these countries was remotely democratic in a way that we would understand it today. All except France were monarchies. In all of them, voting was either absent or limited in some way. And of course, in none of these countries could women vote at all until much later. And all of them were colonial powers to one extent or another. Britain and France were the major worldwide colonial powers. Germany was a newcomer and was developing some colonies in the years before 1914. Russia and Austro-Hungary were continental colonial powers. That is, they had expanded in a continental way and incorporated many other peoples and nationalities within their empires, but were not very present overseas. The Ottoman Empire was not initially part of this Central Power Alliance, but they quickly determined that their existence was at stake. If the so-called good allies won, the Ottoman Empire was going to be carved up, as it eventually was. And just stepping back a little bit, the Ottoman Empire had once been much, much larger. And by the way, even though it incorporated what we now call Turkey, it's sort of an anachronism to call it Turkish or call Turkey one of the combatants of First World War. The Ottoman Empire was a multinational, old-fashioned kind of medieval empire, and at one point had incorporated most of the Balkans, the entire coast of the Black Sea, Egypt, and North Africa. And over the years, it had shrunk because it was weak in the face of the rising European nation states. And its Balkan possessions became independent through the intervention of Russia and Britain, principally. France, in the early 1800s, began to take over the Ottoman territories in North Africa, Algeria first in 1830, then Morocco and Tunisia. Spain joined in. The British had controlled Egypt from 1882. The Russians were expanding from the north and the west. And Britain was also had protectorates or colonies along the Arabian Peninsula that was also threatening Ottoman territory. And by the way, it was well known that even before the outbreak of the First World War, Britain and France in particular had been discussing the breakup of the Ottoman Empire and the seizure of what territories they wanted. So the Ottomans understood that the greatest threat to them was the so-called Allied powers. And Germany and Austria had no territorial aims or colonies in the Middle East, and in fact had pretty good economic and commercial relations with the Ottoman Empire. So they eventually felt that they had to join on the German and Austrian side. And of course, we'll see what happened after that. By the way, the British, some key events in the years preceding the First World War, a French consortium with some British investments built the Suez Canal, which was completed in 1869. And the British later occupied Egypt in 1882, Egypt and Sudan. And by the way, as I'll point out occasionally, that the residue of colonialism is still very much alive. The Suez Company, the French company, the Suez Company that built the canal, still exists after many mergers and descendants and successor companies. It still exists, and as Vivendi or Suez USA or Veolia, for example, it runs the water system in Lynn, and the Boston Public School bus system is run by Veolia. So these old commercial interests still exist, and that goes for oil as well. The British discovered oil in the southern part of what was then called Persia in 1908. And oil, of course, was becoming a very critical strategic resource as the armies were converting from animal-drawn to motorized transport, aircraft, ships, and oil was a very strategic commodity, which Western Europe and the UK in particular did not possess. By the way, Persia at this time was essentially a protectorate of Great Britain and not fully independent. And they signed a long-term lease with very minimal royalties going to them with what became the Anglo-Persian Oil Company. And the British built a huge oil refinery in Abadan here at the head of the Persian Gulf. Anglo-Persian Oil Company later on became the Anglo-Iranian Oil Company after Persia changed its name to Iran. And it still exists also. It's called BP, which used to be British Petroleum. Now it's BP. And of course, thanks to them, the Gulf of Mexico of the United States was severely polluted not too long ago. And it's worth noting that oil, which is very present in the Middle East, was always the target of imperial powers, and that the First World War was essentially the first war where oil was one of the major factors in precipitating it. Winston Churchill, who was then the First Lord of the Admiralty, was in the process of converting British ships from coal propulsion to oil. It was much cheaper and more efficient to run by oil. And he noted, we don't have oil, but we need to control the places where people do have it. And by the way, Churchill, who we'll meet again later, is kind of the hero of our elite ruling class, was an arch racist and colonialist, a really thoroughly bad person whose bust is in the White House today. So we all know about First World War in Europe, the Western Front, so-called, and against the Russians. But there was plenty of war activity in the Middle East as well. And the British early on were hoping to knock the Ottomans out of the war. They launched an invasion first by sea and then by land against Constantinople. They landed troops at what was called Gallipoli, at the straits leading into Constantinople, and failed miserably. Some of you may know there's a pretty good film about this called Gallipoli, where it showed how the British troops in Gallipoli were mostly Australians and New Zealanders and Indians, because it was much easier to bring them here than go all the way around to the Western Front. Mel Gibson was a star of that movie, and it's one of the things that made him a star. But less well known is that the British also invaded Mesopotamia and were trying to take Baghdad. And this also failed. And by the way, it's important to notice that it was the British Army of India that invaded Mesopotamia, which meant it was primarily Indian troops led by British officers, and they failed miserably. In fact, a large British army had to surrender after they were surrounded in the city of Kut. And so the British were reeling that the war against the Ottomans was not going very well, and they were searching around for allies. And they came up with the idea, it was actually reciprocal, that maybe they could take advantage of the Arab population within the Ottoman Empire. Remember, the Ottoman Empire was not Turkish per se, but was multinational, but it was beginning to be influenced by European-style nationalism, the idea that every people, every nation should have their own independent state. In Europe, it was mostly fictional, but it was an idea that took hold. And in fact, the Ottoman Empire, the leaders of the Ottoman Empire, feeling that they were at a disadvantage and had become weak militarily and economically, were also looking toward Europe to create something of a more Turkish identity. And this had the effect of alienating even more the non-Turkish inhabitants of the Ottoman Empire. So a secret correspondence was begun between Sharif Hussein, who was the local leader of the Hejaz, where Mecca and Medina are present along the Red Sea, and the British High Commissioner in Egypt. And eventually they reached an agreement that said if Sharif Hussein would lead an Arab uprising against the Ottomans, the British would promise him an independent Arab state or states within these boundaries that they agreed on. And you can see it here. It includes everything that we call the Levant and the northern Arab lands and the Arabian Peninsula, with the only exception, because they had already promised a French interest in Lebanon along the coast here. But other than that, they were promised an independent state. But meanwhile, secretly, not very many months later, a French bureaucrat and a British officer got together and made a secret agreement, the Sykes-Picot Agreement, to divide up the Middle East between them and the other Allied powers. Initially, it included Russia and Italy and Greece, who were on the Allied side, and was going to divide up the rest of Turkey, which is here. But for our purposes, the main aspect that's important is that the British and French basically divided up the Arab-speaking areas of the Middle East. The French got the area, the northern part, what became Syria, among other things. The British got the southern part with direct control over Mesopotamia, where there was oil already discovered. And Palestine was to be shared among the imperial powers because they all had religious interests in it. And sort of remarkably, the British are good record keepers. The original map that they stood around and drew these lines on is still preserved in the British Foreign Office. You can see it here. And down in the corner, the signatures of Francois-Georges Picot and Mark Sykes, and the date 8 May 1916. That is only a few months after the Arabs were promised independence. And by the way, what's shown here in yellow, again, Palestine was supposed to be shared by all the Allied powers, with one exception. The British reserved for themselves the area around Haifa, which was the best port along the Levant, and they had interest in connecting that later on with their oil-producing regions in Iraq. And we'll see that's what actually happened. In fact, after the First World War, the British built a pipeline and a railroad from Kirkuk, the oil fields there, through Iraq, Jordan, and Palestine to the port of Haifa, where there was an oil refinery, and of course they could ship it conveniently to Europe. Now, having promised Palestine first to the Arabs as part of their independent state, second to be shared with the other Allied powers secretly, the British promised Palestine a third time to a different group. And this was the famous Balfour Declaration issued on November 2nd, 1917. Now, this had no legal standing. The declaration was in the form of a letter from British Foreign Minister Arthur Balfour to Lord Rothschild, a very wealthy and influential Jewish British citizen, and simply saying His Majesty's government will view with favor the establishment in Palestine of a national home for the Jewish people, and then adding some sort of caveats. Of course, this won't affect the civil rights of the people that already live there, and it won't take anything away from the rights of Jews who live in other countries. And we'll see those were mutually contradictory means. It was only 67 words long, but those 67 words are echoing today in the Middle East and what we're facing. Now, you might be interested to know Lord Balfour was not acting out of any particular love for the Jewish people or for any sort of democratic values. In fact, when he was prime minister in 1905, he sponsored and succeeded in passing a measure called the Aliens Act, which was aimed to bar Jewish refugees fleeing the anti-Jewish pogroms that were going on then in the Russian Empire from entering Great Britain. And by the way, before he became prime minister, he was the British first secretary for Ireland, where he led violent repression of the then Irish independence movement, and was named by the Irish Bloody Balfour. So what did he want? Well, Balfour, like many of upper class British people and elsewhere, was sort of socially and pretty consistently anti-Semitic in his own views, but he, as a consequence of that, he also had this idea that Jewish influence around the world, politically and economically, was very, very powerful, and therefore anything he could do to placate the Jews, in his mind, would benefit the war effort. And it should be remembered that the language of the Balfour Declaration was under discussion for a year before it was finally issued. It went through many, many drafts and iterations. And the belief at the beginning was that doing something for the Jews would help to keep Russia in the war, which had a large Jewish population, and help to entice the United States into the war, which also had a large Jewish population and, to his mind, very influential. But the real reason had to do with imperial geopolitics. The idea that a British-sponsored Jewish state in Palestine would be dependent, basically a useful dependency for Britain, and would be a forward defense of the Suez Canal. It certainly wasn't any love for the Jews that motivated Balfour and Rothschild, but geostrategic thinking. Now, as you probably know, the United States didn't join the war until 1917. And there was a lot of high-sounding rhetoric around that. Woodrow Wilson, who was in an address to Congress, claimed that this was a war to make the world safe for democracy and the right of people to have a voice in their own governments. But of course, the United States in those days was also very far from a democracy. Woodrow Wilson, who was the darling of liberal interventionists today and for the last many decades, was born into a slaveholding family in Virginia before the Civil War. He was an ardent racist who introduced Jim Crow into the government offices in Washington, D.C., and he held a special showing of the racist film Birth of a Nation at the White House. And not only that, but the U.S. was also a colonial power then. Obviously, the first 100 years or so was the United States expanding in a continental way, expelling or killing the indigenous peoples, taking land from Mexico and so on. But after the Spanish-American War, it became an overseas colonial empire, and those colonies still exist. By the way, again, on the idea that colonial is not something in the past. Of course, Puerto Rico and the Virgin Islands are U.S. colonies. In the Pacific, Samoa, Guam, and the Marshall Islands are still U.S. colonies. We don't call them that, but that's what they are. So we'll come back to that. From the point of view of the Middle East, though, the U.S. was either not a colonial power or one that was far away and not threatening them. So again, with this highfalutin rhetoric, among other things, Wilson said that part of the war aims was that people should be able to choose their own governments and not be handed around as colonies from one colonial power to another. But that's exactly what was going on. And pretty amazingly, this conversation between the British Prime Minister, David Lloyd George, and the French Prime Minister, Georges Clemenceau, took place on December 1st, 1918, during a stroll in the British Embassy and the French Embassy in London. And sort of remarkably, it was recorded. And the gist of it is, remember, they had agreed previously on the carve-up of the Middle East and the Sykes-Picot Agreement. Now Russia was out of the war and was not a party to it. So they were up for sort of renegotiating. And Clemenceau asked Lloyd George, "So what do you want in the Middle East?" And Lloyd George replied, "Mosul." Mosul was the northern part of what's today Iraq, but it was originally to be part of the French mandate. Mosul. And Clemenceau said, "Okay, you shall have it. What else?" And Lloyd George said, "Palestine." And Clemenceau said, "Okay, you can have that too." And in that sort of informal conversation, the borders of the Middle East were set by two prime ministers in the garden of the British in London. And of course, we'll come back to this, but basically all of these people, this territory was fairly homogeneous in being a mosaic of Christians, Muslims, and Jews, Arabs, Kurds, Armenians, and so on. And although these divisions became borders eventually, it was the same people on all sides of these borders as it is today. So the war eventually, the Central Powers were defeated in Europe, and they agreed to sue for peace based on the principles that Wilson had outlined in his 14-point plan. And the summaries are, an end to secret diplomacy, freedom of trade in the seas, a League of Nations, and most importantly, self-determination for former imperial possessions. And he was very specific about it in Europe, naming the places that should become independent. And in fact, many new nations were created in Europe as a result of the breakup of the old empires. Czechoslovakia, the Baltic countries, Poland, Yugoslavia, and so on. But the reality was that self-determination in this context was something that was reserved for white Europeans and not for colonial subjects. And in fact, not a single colony of the European powers became independent following the First World War. For many of them, it wasn't until after the Second World War, or sometimes even in the 60s and 70s, after long, crushing battles, that they achieved their independence. And by the way, the German colonies in Africa, Tanganyika, Southwest Africa, Cameroon, were simply redistributed among the British and French and remained colonies in some cases until the late 1970s. So instead of decolonizing, the victorious powers invented a new concept, what they called mandates, which were in effect supposedly temporary colonies. That is, it was thought that these benighted peoples in the Middle East, especially that had formerly been under the Ottoman control, were not yet ready for independence. So they needed a European overlord to sort of help them along and until they were ready for independence. And of course, when that would happen was never specified. But in the Covenant of the League of Nations, it was specified that the mandatory powers were to govern these communities with their welfare in mind. The wishes of these communities must be the principal condition for the choosing of the mandatory powers. Of course, this was total hypocrisy. As Lord Balfour said not long after that, his successor as foreign minister was having second thoughts about this, and Balfour wrote in a letter, "In Palestine, we do not propose even to go through the form of consulting the wishes of the present inhabitants of the country. The four great powers are committed to Zionism, and Zionism, right or wrong, will be our policy." And by the way, at that time, the population of Palestine was more than 90% Muslim and Christian Arabs, and between 5 and 7% Jews, most of whom were part of communities that had long roots in Palestine and were not Zionists at all. The rest of the countries in the Middle East became independent or fully independent, as you see here. And of course, the Algerians had to fight. It took 130 years for Algeria to achieve independence from France, and the rest of the countries, more or less in the 50s, 60s, and 70s, achieved independence. Now, it's worth now going back to talk about Zionism, what it is. And we need to understand that Zionism was a movement, a European movement in the first place. A movement prior to becoming a Jewish movement was a Christian movement. That is, the idea that the Jews going back to Palestine would initiate the end times, the Christian end times, was something that was discussed among Protestants, especially in Western Europe, going back centuries. But Zionism as a Jewish movement only goes back to the latter part of the 19th century. And its advocates were primarily living in Germany, Poland, Russia, and so on. Their native language was Yiddish, not Hebrew, or if they were more cosmopolitan, they spoke German, Polish, or Russian. And almost invariably, they were people of Jewish descent, but not observant. They were secular people. And they adopted this idea of a Jewish nationalism in response to the relatively new phenomenon of ethnic nationalism in Europe. We sometimes think, France and Germany are these, long-lived countries. In fact, it was quite new. The idea that a nation and a people were the same thing was a very new concept in Europe. Germany, as we know, it didn't get unified until 1871. Italy, about the same time. Belgium was founded in 1820 and so on. But there began to be this mythology that a state and its people were one thing and shared a common ethnic history. And in this model, for those who adopted that ethnic view, and particularly those who were racially oriented, the Jews didn't have a place because they weren't part of the nations that formed the states in Europe. And the Zionists effectively accepted and adopted that idea. Now, of course, Jews had been persecuted, principally in Europe, for many, many years, centuries. But prior to modern times, the persecution of Jews was based on religious grounds. That is, they were persecuted because they didn't accept Christianity. And if they converted, as some of them did, they were fully accepted as Christians, Protestants or Catholics. There were Jews who became bishops in the Catholic Church, for example, Jewish people born Jewish. But what was new in the 19th century was the racialization of anti-Semitism. That is, the Jews were not just religious dissenters, but an alien race from the point of view of the right wing of sort of European nationalists. And therefore, they had no part in Europe. And that's when the phrase, the term anti-Semitism was coined. I mean, it's a ridiculous. Semitic is a language family. not a nationality or a people. It's the language family of Arabic, ancient Hebrew, Babylonian, Aramaic, and so on. And of course, these people who were being persecuted by anti-Semites did not speak, they spoke European languages. But this racialized anti-Semitism was then accepted by the Zionists, who adopted it as their, that they were a nation too, and they didn't belong in Europe. They belonged someplace else. And again, I remind you that there were a lot of Jews that lived in what we call the Middle East and North Africa, and they had no part in the creation of Zionism. They were pretty assimilated within the Arab and Persian cultures of the Middle East. You can see these are Zionist Jews in Austria, and these are Jews who lived in Iraq and Iran, and they spoke Arabic or Farsi. Their culture was Arab. Their religion, to the degree they followed it, was Jewish. And they, intermittently, things weren't always rosy for them. I mean, as any religious minority, they sometimes suffered discrimination or persecution. But the kind of racialized persecution that grew up in Europe was never part of Middle Eastern culture. And the Jews prospered in the Middle East, and were not Zionists. Zionism, again, was a European movement and had very little support among the Jews of the Middle East. And just as an indication, I point out in passing, the national anthem adopted by Israel after it became a state was written by a Yiddish-speaking person in Galicia, which was the Austrian-ruled part of Ukraine, and adopted from the music from an Italian folk song. And it includes, as it includes today, as long as deep within the heart a Jewish soul yearns, and toward the edges of the East an eye to Zion looks. Even the Jewish national anthem is written from a European point of view. Of course, if you're in Israel, you're not looking to the East to Zion. That only makes sense from Europe. And again, Zionism in its early decades and in most of the beginning of the 20th century was very much a minority movement among Jews. Most Jews, wherever they lived, including the United States, had their aims to achieve full and non-discriminatory citizenship where they lived. And that was the mainstream in the United States. The Zionists were very much a minority here and elsewhere. And in fact, when the Balfour Declaration was issued, the only Jewish member of the British cabinet, Edwin Montagu, vehemently opposed it. and many Jews there and in the United States opposed it, but recognizing Zionism was convenient for the imperial powers, and therefore they kind of allowed them to represent Jewish thinking. And of course, in Europe, left-wing Jews, some of them were in groups that advocated the preservation of Jewish cultural values while being assimilated into their nations where they lived. Others became left-wing socialists or communists and were in favor of, de-emphasizing nationality and religion. So again, a small minority. And of course, throughout the history and still today, the highly observant Jews were never part of Zionism. Some have sort of made peace with it now, but many have not. And for many decades and still today in Israel, there are highly observant Jews who demonstrate in favor of Palestine. And when I visited Gaza in 2009, there was a whole group of people from this group, Netzarei Karta. You see one here, Rabbi David, who, when we brought medical supplies to the Al-Shifa hospital, he was there carrying a Palestinian flag, and they wore these name tags, a Jew, not a Zionist. So even today in the United States, some of the major Hasidic groups, like the Satmars, are vehemently anti-Zionist. Their religion tells them that only God can create a renewed state of Israel, and not ungodly, irreligious people. And by the way, in terms of Hamas anti-Semitism, when we met with then head of Hamas, Ismail Haniyeh, who was since assassinated by the Israelis, he insisted on inviting representatives of this Orthodox Jewish group onto the podium when he addressed us. And that's a picture I took at that time. Now, in the United States, ironically, the chief leaders of the Zionist movement were relatively upper-class aristocratic Jews who came from Central Europe, Germany and Austria, and who spoke German, not Yiddish, and who had no intention whatsoever of going themselves to live in Palestine. But these were the influential voices that leaned on Woodrow Wilson and the U.S. Congress to come out in support of the Zionist cause. And my belief is that part of their motivation was recognizing that the new Jewish immigrants to the United States coming from impoverished villages and towns in Eastern Europe were not the kind of people they wanted in the United States. They were the wrong kind of Jews. And you look at the difference. Of course, most of the Jewish population in the United States has their roots to these kinds of immigrants. And so these folks, this is a picture taken on a boat on their way to the treaty negotiations at the end of the First World War, where they advocated in favor of Zionism. And of course, the founder, the prophet of Zionism, Theodor Herzl, was also a secular Austrian Jew, and he wrote the sort of Bible of Zionism, the Jewish State, Judenstaat, which, by the way, has this sort of somewhat eerie subtitle, A Modern Solution for the Jewish Question. He wrote in his diary that the anti-Semites will become our most dependable friends, the anti-Semitic countries our allies. And of course, that was true, and it's true today. For example, in 1976, the Israeli government welcomed a state visit by John Forster, the president of South Africa, who had been interned during the Second World War by the British because of his Nazi sympathies. And he was welcomed and feted. And some of you may know that Israel was one of the most important supporters of apartheid South Africa and arming it despite breaking the UN sanctions. There are many, many other examples. For instance, Adolf Eichmann, who, when he was captured and brought to Israel, that was his second time visiting Palestine. The first time, he was there officially as a Nazi envoy, hoping to research and organize the emigration of German Jews to Palestine then. And of course, the Zionist movement even signed an agreement with the Nazi government in the early 1930s which in effect broke the international boycott of Nazi Germany to trade importing Nazi German goods for allowing Jewish immigration to Palestine. And you could give many other examples. Of course, today, Donald Trump is the greatest, most popular U.S. politician in Israel, and there are many, many other examples. So the informal agreements that the British and French had arrived at to divide up the Middle East were then formalized at the San Remo Conference in 1920. Again, this was not legal in the sense this was might makes right. This was a conference of the victorious Allied powers, and they agreed on post-war policy and agreed to have a common front in the League of Nations. And at this conference, the Zionist movement was very amply represented, but no Arabs were there representing the interests of the people who lived in the Middle East. And this conference adopted the Balfour Declaration and the previous decisions to divide up the Middle East, which were then proposed and passed by the League of Nations. Meanwhile, the Arabs, kind of holding the British to their promise of Arab independence, had elected Faisal, one of the sons of Sharif Hussein, as the king of Syria. Understood then, as we'll see, Syria was not the Syrian state now. It was understood to be the Levant, a larger state. But his rule lasted only a very few months when the French marched their army from the coast of Lebanon to take Damascus and defeated the Arab nationalists. And again, the French army that invaded Syria was an Arab African army led by French officers. French colonial troops from Senegal and so on were the main invaders. Again, the colonists always like to rule on the cheap, using the colonial troops to police themselves and further their interests. Meanwhile, the British had a conference in Cairo to finalize their arrangements for their part of the Middle East. And here's our friend Winston Churchill. This is Lawrence of Arabia and Gertrude Bell and many other signatories. And they basically agreed on what was going to be the final settlement of the Middle East. And after a hard day of drawing up the Middle East map, this very iconic photo was taken in front of the Sphinx. Again, Churchill, Gertrude Bell, Lawrence of Arabia. And what they did was, in order to help put down the revolt in Iraq, Mesopotamia, that was led mostly by the Shia communities along the Euphrates and the Tigris, they decided to put Faisal, who was now unemployed, having been deposed as the king of Syria, they made him the king of Iraq. And they put down the revolt against British rule very brutally, using air power and possibly poison gas. Certainly, Winston Churchill actively supported the idea of using poison gas against the rebels in Iraq. And by the way, Iraq then and now has a Shia Muslim majority, and by placing a Sunni who had never been to Iraq as the king, this was a way of Britain being their patron and sort of exercising indirect control over the population of Iraq, and again set the stage for the kind of inter-ethnic, inter-religious conflicts that came up many years later. The British, of course, were the experts in divide and rule, and they had long centuries of practice of this in India. This was how a handful of British bureaucrats and officers ruled a subcontinent of hundreds of millions of people, if by dividing it up and recruiting one group against another, and in particular, as was the practice of all the colonial nations, to adopt and be the patron of minority groups who would then look to the colonial power as their protector. And in Britain, in India, it was primarily the Sikhs and the Muslims that were the closest supporters of the British control, because they looked to British to protect them from the Hindu majority. And the same thing happened everywhere where colonial powers ruled. For instance, in Indochina, the French promoted the Catholics over the Buddhists and so on, and this went on. There's an old saying among the Irish that if two neighbors are having a fight, one of them must have been visited by a Britishman the day before. And of course, Ireland is also divided and was divided then by the British along religious grounds. The French followed the same game plan. This is their mandate of Syria. They divided it up first by declaring the coastal region of Lebanon independent. Lebanon had a history. The area in the Mount Lebanon near Beirut had been on and off autonomous under the Ottoman Empire, but this new greater Lebanon that included both not only Maronite Christians and Druze, but also large numbers of Sunni and Shia Muslims, was the creation of the French. And then the rest, they divided up. The Arab national movement was based among the Sunni majority, so they divided up Damascus and Aleppo, the two major states. They declared a separate Druze state in the south and a separate Alawite state along the coast north of Lebanon. And this area of their mandate, they eventually gave over to Turkey after a sort of faked plebiscite that led them an exit. So divide and rule was very much the policy of the French also. And this was the Mandate flag, by the way, which you see has been adopted by the opposition, the Syrian opposition, now the people who control Syria. This was originally the French mandate flag. So what we have as a result of European colonial interference, this one sort of cultural area that was overwhelmingly Arab, spoke a dialect of Arab that was mutually intelligible. Of course, there were other dialects in Egypt and the Arabic Peninsula. Culturally, it was pretty uniform. Instead of being one independent nation, it was divided up by the colonial powers in the borders that we see today, which were all set by the British and the French. And again, I remind you, it was the same people on every side of these borders. And of course, we'll see what followed from that next time. But meanwhile, before I finish, I just want to mention that it didn't have to be this way. Interestingly, the U.S., when it joined the war against Germany and Austria, never declared war against the Ottoman Empire. And there were people in the United States that had some knowledge of the Middle East, particularly Protestant missionaries, who had the idea that maybe we should ask the people who lived there what they wanted for their future. This was as opposed to meeting in Rome or Paris to determine it. And they prevailed on Wilson. Initially, it was to be sponsored also by the French and British, but they dropped out, to create a commission to actually go to the Middle East and ask people what they wanted. And it was led by Charles Crane, a plumbing manufacturing magnate, who the Crane Company still exists. Some of you may notice it, particularly in public facilities. There's the sinks and toilets have a bird on it, the crane, named after his company. And Henry King, who was the president of Oberlin College and connected with missionaries, they went and traveled around the Middle East and had hearings all over the Levant. And they reported back what the people wanted. First of all, they wanted an independent Syria of this whole area in Levant. If they couldn't have that right away, they wanted the U.S. to be the mandatory power, and not the British and French, on the theory that, taking, at face value, American insistence on self-determination and the idea that the U.S. was not a colonial power. It was, of course, but not in this area. By the way, I'm reminded, some of you may be familiar with the infamous poem by Rudyard Kipling, The White Man's Burden. But I doubt if any of you know that it was written in cheering for the U.S. occupation of the Philippines, where the U.S. was to carry out its civilizing mission on its Philippine colony. So they looked to independence or an American mandate, and of course they were adamantly opposed to a Jewish state in Palestine. And their report, which was very prescient, was buried and not published for many years afterwards. But it concluded in this language: not only U.S. president, but the American people as a whole should realize that if the American government decided to support the establishment of a Jewish state in Palestine, they are committing the American people to the use of force in that area, since only by force can a Jewish state in Palestine be established or maintained. And of course, that's where we stand today. I just want to end on advocating the importance of understanding this history. James Baldwin spoke about it, and the great force of history that we carry within us, that we're not always aware of, but we are unconsciously controlled by it in many ways. And history is literally present in all we do. William Faulkner said it more concisely: the past is never dead, it's not even past. So I'll pass it on now to our hosts, and in any time we have left, we'll have some questions or discussion. So Julie, take it away.
Thank you so much, Jeff. We learned an immense amount of history in a very understandable way. Your presentation with the pictures and the maps, and of course your words. So thank you so much. And I'm going to pass it on to Cole, who has a few announcements, and we're going to open the chat so people can start putting their questions in the chat. And then Zarina and I will alternate in asking questions. We're not going to get to all the questions. We only have about 15 or 20 minutes at this point. And of course, we're meeting again next week on Sunday. So we'll try to get to some of the questions then.
Yeah, just quickly, I'm just going to mention two coming events organized by MAPPA. One is a medical report back. They shoot children in the head. A U.S. surgeon reports what he saw in Gaza. This is on Wednesday night with Dr. Feroz Sidwa, a trauma surgeon who spent time in Gaza earlier this year. So be sure to sign up for that. I'm going to put the links to both of these in the chat so that you can find them more quickly. But that's a webinar on Wednesday night. And the other one is we have a conference, Arise and Resist, Organizing for Peace and Justice Under Repression. This will be a face-to-face conference in person at Roxbury Community College on Sunday, January 19th. It's initiated by MAPPA, but sponsored and co-sponsored by a whole bunch of Massachusetts organizations, both those concerned with Palestine and those more broadly concerned with peace and other progressive issues. So we've got a lot of great speakers and breakouts and tables. It's going to be an organizing discussion, so that'll be a really important organizing and networking event. So hope you can all join us there. And let me turn it back to Julie and Zarina for the question period.
Did you want me to ask the first question, Julie?
Yes.
Okay.
Please.
There are already several that were asked during the talk. So I'm just going to go through the first one, and the second one I see is in the chat. It says, I'd like to ask Jeff if he's aware that one of the reasons for our dependence on oil is an agreement between Edison and Ford to further development petrol run rather than electric automobiles, which were already available commercially since the end of the 19th century. So, Jeff?
Well, I'm not an expert on that. Of course, there were also steam automobiles in those days. I mean, the history of, the creation of, the sort of petrol economy that we have now is long and complicated, but military considerations had an important part of it from the get-go. Oil was a cheap form of powering war vehicles and planes and so on. And so it was a strategic interest then, as it is now. And of course, the U.S. had plenty of oil and still has plenty of oil, by the way. We'll talk about that in the future. The U.S. interest in oil and control of oil in the Middle East had nothing to do with the needs of U.S. oil consumption. It had to do with controlling oil as a strategic commodity that gave the U.S. power. So the U.S. has almost always been a net exporter of petroleum products, as it is today.
Thank you.
Jeff, I just have to say this, the chat is filled with a bunch of applause and thank you, and really thank you for enlightening us all. So I have a question here. What about the claim by some Jews saying that the Palestinian area was historically in a religious book, originally only inhabited by the Jewish people, and therefore was only to be inhabited by Jews, versus Palestine actually being inhabited by Palestinian or Arabs, Jews, and Christians?
Of course, this gets into a lot of ancient history, but the short story is, even if we believe the stories of the Bible of the Exodus from Egypt and the conquest of Canaan, what we call Palestine was not empty even then. Of course, the Bible talks about the Jews Jews is by an anachronism, by the way. The ancient name for people who became Jews was Judeans or Israelites. They conquered it from the people who already lived there. So when do you start the clock counting? And of course, the founders of modern Zionism and the state of Israel were not believers at all. The first prime minister, Ben Gurion, announced, ironically, I don't believe in God, but I know he promised us the Holy Land. So, and by the way, I meant to state earlier that on the question of settler colonialism, for the first 45 years or so of Israel's history, not one of their prime ministers had been born within the borders of the country that became Israel. And to this day, as far as I'm aware, there's never been an Israeli prime minister whose parents were born in the territory of Israel. So clearly, they came from someplace else, and whether they were returning from a supposed ancient state 3,000 years ago or not, they were in fact coming from Europe in the first place, and they were the sort of Hebrew language was resurrected and reinvented, and many of them changed their names to names that sounded more, local or ancient, but they were overwhelmingly the first generations of leadership in Israel were European, Polish, Russian, and German Jews.
I have a point or a question and that's my personal question. So when the Kama Sutra was written in India, the British were known to be clubbing each other, and so they're the masters of war. Do you know of any other culture that was also settler colonial, like aside the European nationalists?
I mean, a settler colony originating from outside of Europe or America?
Yes. Mm-hmm.
I don't think so. I mean, there were movements of lots of peoples around the world. In Asia, for instance, there was an Indian diaspora into Malaysia, Indonesia, Indochina. There was a Chinese diaspora, but in no cases did they conquer and displace the local people. They kind of settled and traded, and it was only when the Europeans came that that settler colonialism became an issue. As far as I'm aware, I mean, there might be some other examples, but settler colonialism was a European colonial phenomenon, and then American. Of course, we are a successful outcome of European settler colonialism, and Canada, Australia, New Zealand. There were other places that failed: Algeria, South Africa, Vietnam. And they had to fight for decades to get their independence.
And we haven't resolved that settler colonial problems in this country for 400 or more years. So, and I know Ireland was going through it for like 700 years with Britain. So it's endless.
Yeah, I meant to say also, if you pretend to start this conflict on October 7th of 2023, it's like saying the wars of the Europeans against the indigenous people in the United States started after Custer's last stand in 1876. It's just an absurdity if you think about it. The Europeans have been displacing and slaughtering Native people for 2 centuries before that, but the Indians were the aggressors in our mythology.
Cowboys and Indians.
So here's a question about Herzl. And didn't he realize before he died that the idea of a Jewish state in Palestine was impractical?
No. It's true that in the early decades of the Zionist movement, they considered alternative locations for a supposed Jewish state: Argentina, Uganda, or but eventually, for all kinds of reasons, including the biblical connection, they decided on Palestine. And again, they had this idea, we'll talk about next time, that Palestine was basically empty. Of course, it wasn't. But when they learned that a lot of people already lived there, they talked mostly privately that the indigenous inhabitants would have to be gotten rid of one way or another. And, of course, that's what happened. That's what settler colonialism is all about. It's not just of ruling a foreign place, it's ruling a foreign place and eliminating or dispossessing the local population. And that's why it's very apt to me about Israel.
I have the next question. Amazing presentation. Thank you very much. My question is to know what extent the Zionist movement / Jewish people influenced the U.S. foreign policy in the past and the present. It's not related to your talk right now.
Yeah. I mean, the short answer is, first of all, not all people who identify as Jews are Zionists. But ultimately the mainstream of sort of organized Jewish America was won over to Zionism. And of course, they have a lot of influence on U.S. policy. And we're going to talk about this in future classes in some more detail. But, you have to have your head in the sand not to understand that Israel and its supporters, primarily Jews, but also Christian Zionists, have a huge influence on U.S. politics and policy.
I have a question from the chat that's also not directly related to the talk today, but I'll read it anyway. It says, thanks very much, Jeff. Could you talk about the relationship between the Islamic Brotherhood of Egypt and later Hamas with millennialist Zionism?
Let's not get into that now. I mean, there are a lot of
Fair enough.
religious, cultural, and political strains within Islam, of which the Muslim Brotherhood is one. And maybe we'll talk about that in some more detail later on. But
I wonder if we should open up the questions by raising hands so people that are not comfortable to chat, maybe they can ask their questions. I have another quick question. Was there ever a goal of freeing a country or having a democratic other nations, or is it all about the dominance factor?
what's the it that you?
It is coexistence in the world versus once the land is occupied by something, then we got it all.
Well, the idea of the exclusive ownership of a state by one so-called people or a national religious community is something that developed in Europe. And it took centuries of war to sort of become a reality in the nation states that we know today. It's not the normal thing. Before relatively recent times, every polity, every kingdom or nation was multi-ethnic, multi-religious, and centuries of ethnic cleansing and this idea that a state and a people had to be one led, through violence, led to the situation we have today. So it was never a historical understanding in the Middle East before modern times that only this group should own the state or that group should own the state. It was something that was essentially imported from Europe, and it had a lot of prestige because the European states were powerful. They defeated the old-fashioned Ottoman Empire. So this model was very attractive, but it was always artificial. The idea of the equality of a people and a state was artificial. The famous anthropologist Benedict Anderson called them imagined communities. So it's not that nations created states, states created nations. And for example, when Italy was mostly unified in the middle of the 19th century, a peasant in Sicily could not understand the language of a merchant in Venice. a Frenchman, a peasant in southern France in Provence, couldn't understand how a peasant in Brittany spoke. And it was only the creation of states that developed national languages, national education, and this myth of a common racial history. This had no history in Asia and the Middle East. As you know, in India, it was a British concept that created it. So I don't advocate pure nation states anywhere. I mean, live and let live and multicultural states are what we should aim for. And therefore, coexistence and secular governments are what, we should support. And that means we should oppose a strict Sunni Muslim government or a strict Jewish government or a Kurdish government and so on. I mean, that's just not feasible in the Middle East. The Middle East is a mosaic of religions and ethnicities.
And we should change the name. Sorry.
And if we want to have every group have their own self-determination and nationality, it means centuries of warfare, more centuries of warfare. We've already had a century of warfare in the Middle East. It means more of that.
I propose a change to oil-rich nations rather than Middle East at this point.
Well, Western Asia is good. It's technically Western. What we should say, but again, even, the largest Arabic language pan-Arab newspaper is called in Arabic, Sharq al-Awsat, the Middle East. So we're kind of stuck with it. Just like we're stuck using the term Americans to describe citizens of the United States, right? I mean,
yes,
we understand where that comes from, but it's hard to get away from it.
All right. Well, I just wanted to read, Jill Al-Ashkar wrote, "Thank you. What a wealth of information." And so I think on that note, we're going to end the session. It's after 4:30. We thank you so much for all that you have shared with us today. We thank you all for being with us today. And we look forward to next week, Sunday, same time, same place.
Also, if you have questions before the presentation, please email us at Mass Peace Action and definitely come to the future webinars.
It's PI, letters PI at masspeaceaction.org will come to me. I will look at the chat and attempt to answer some questions next time or in between. If there's a way of communicating in between, I'll try to do that. And I recognize, time is short. Hopefully we'll have more time in the next session for questions and discussion. Apologies for that. It's harder. I used to do this in 8-hour-and-a-half sessions. As some of you may know, it's much more difficult to be brief than it is to be lengthy. And I hate to leave stuff out. It's my bad habit. So anyway, thank you all. And hopefully I'll see you next week. And also for those who didn't attend today, this is being streamed on YouTube and elsewhere. I don't know how easy it is to find that, but it's going to be posted on YouTube. I don't know if I guess if you Google it, you'll find it. It'll
probably be on the Mass Peace Action page too, possibly, right, Cole?
We will send out a follow-up with a link, but it's on the Mass Peace Action YouTube channel. Yes.
Okay.
All right.
Who unmuted me?
Thank you.
Bye now.
Bye.
Right.
Thanks, Jeff.
Bye,
See you
Jeff.
soon.